in 2023, water will be boiled.
All right, welcome to another episode of Increments. Faden, we've been getting some requests to do some episodes on the social dilemma and the state of social media and whatnot in general. After listening to a couple podcasts about social media and perhaps viewing the social dilemma, are you ready to admit that I've always been right about the negative influence of social media?
I'm so torn on that subject. I'm really looking forward to this episode because I think I'm more dogmatic in my view that you're wrong than I was before I watched the social dilemma. and
well,
in fact, I hate documentaries, man, because documentaries take
Faden just hates real facts.
No. So take a fact, take a normal fact, put behind the fact a soundtrack. A really ominous soundtrack or a happy soundtrack, and instead take that fact and make a bunch of actors act that fact out. And then the fact can be whatever the hell you want, and you're going to change people's views based on this music and the lighting and all of the tricks which reality television uses, people use in documentaries. And so documentaries are I'm now thinking the lowest form of fact delivery. And so I'm really looking forward to this episode because I'm very torn on how I feel about it. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're hearing Vaden inoculate himself right now against all forms of criticism. I refuse to listen to documentaries. No, I'm kidding. Actually, I haven't actually finished it yet. Yep. I'm pretty slow with watching stuff, but I actually understand your skepticism of the documentary. So for one, I'm recognizing right away that it plays into all my biases, so I have to be very on guard when I'm watching it. But I'm really just trying to separate actual fear of fear which is well posed against just fear of the new. So I think in a lot of that documentary there's just fear of new technologies. That's exactly, and things you don't understand versus very, and then I think there are some aspects that we should actually be on guard against, and so trying to battle with that and figure out which aspects of what they're saying fall in what camp is pretty difficult.
That is exactly what I've been going through, and I don't have my thoughts formulated on that yet, so we're not talking about that this episode. Psych. But we will be talking about that soon. Instead, we're talking about prediction and prophecy in the social sciences, which is chapter 16. I think I got that wrong in the middle of the episode, but chapter 16 of Conjectures and Refutations. We go and do a close reading of this one. I don't know. I think the episode was pretty good. I hit you at the beginning with an extended quote from Mein Kampf, which maybe wasn't the most chivalrous way to open the episode. So listeners should be on guard for that. But hopefully it was.
People are going to cut your voice out and put you on Twitter or something.
Yeah, man. But yeah, so I don't know. Anything do you think we should say about this particular episode?
I only want to apologize for my state of incoherence. Vaden really came out of the gate running and had such good examples and was so persuasive. I just wanted to listen to him talk the whole time. And so when it was my turn to say something, I just kind of froze. So if you have a skip Ben button on your media player, this would definitely be the good time to use it. And just Vaden's making a lot of sense in this episode. And then every time I say something, I feel I take what is a relatively simple idea and just butcher it. Anyway.
there's nothing saying, I quoted Mein Kampf a lot, and then have you say, yeah, he's making a lot of sense. He really was persuasive. So there's not only Mein Kampf. That is just an example to justify the seriousness of the subject, in fact. So with that happy, jovial intro, let's get real. Last couple days, I've gone from knowing about historicism to being really terrified of it, and I hope to convince you and the audience that it's a big deal.
Nice.
And so so the chapter is prediction and prophecy in the historical sciences, and so to set it up a little bit for the audience, historicism is something which runs throughout Popper's work. And he wrote a whole book called The Poverty of Historicism. And it also was a major focal point in his Open Society and Its Enemies. But it was actually only upon rereading this chapter that it kind of hit like why it is so important. So I want to try to convey that because I think that the content of the chapter will only be understood given the importance of this subject. So
are you having like new car syndrome with historicism? Now you just see historicism everywhere. And
I see history, and particularly the 20th century, quite differently now. So like eventually I'm going to talk about all the Mein Kampf that I've been reading, because it just it pervades Hitler's writing. And it wasn't until I like read a whole chapter that was just pure historicism that I realized how terrifying this idea is. So I think like I was trying to explain it to Helena last night, and I realized a good starting place is just to talk about like prophecy in general. So when you think about prophecy, or when I think about prophecy, I think of like the Mayan apocalyptic prediction, say, or that like in 2012 the world is going to come to an end, or like another example would be like ISIS, and they would prophesize the return of like the Roman Empire or the Empire of Rome into a place in Iraq, and it's like these prediction of events long in the future. And if that was all historicism was, it wouldn't be too scary. But to try to convey this to Helena last night, I came up with this example. So it's like, imagine that everyone around you starts to take this idea that there is like an impending race war very seriously. So somewhere in the next 50 to 100 years, there is an inevitable race war between, say, the blacks and the whites and the Indians, and like every country on Earth is going to team up based on its race, and places like Canada will become like multicultural places will just descend into civil war, and like India versus Japan. And like this is not a prophecy. It's not like the Mayans. It's science. It's a scientific like certainty. It's as inevitable as the sun. And given that this is an inevitability, the question that like you would have to ask yourself is like, what are you going to do, right? Are you going to like? So there's nothing you can do to change it. It's coming. And the question is like, what do you do? And so one thing you could do, I guess, is just wait for the race war, which is coming. But something that most people, I think, would want to do is start to prepare for it, right? Start to take sides and start to like, in fact, like maybe the best thing to do is to be like preventative, to strike first even, because this is coming, and the only thing we can do is start preparing for it. And the key thing is that it's not prophecy. It is a law. It's a law of history. It is it's a scientific law in the same way that like Newton's laws are able to give us predictive power over the world. Once we understand historical laws, then we'll be able to also understand the trajectory of the world. And so this is historicism. It's the belief that there are laws of history which can be understood and then allow you to predict what is coming. And the race war thing is a real example. It's like what animated Hitler. And then you swap out race with class, and then you get the same thing. So like I want to read a couple quotes actually, because it sounds almost like ludicrous that this is something which people would say. But I got a copy of Mein Kampf. I hadn't had one before.
I was going to say, you didn't just have it lying around.
Yeah, I didn't just like dust it off the shelf. And in chapter 11, it's all about race and the nation. And so I'm going to read a quote from Hitler. So he says that. So he's talking about like the Aryan race and how understanding the history of the Aryan race allows the German people to like kind of basically take their full height as a people. So they say, Hitler says this: "It was not by mere chance that the first form of civilization arose where the Aryans came into conflict with inferior races, subjugated them, and forced them to obey. The members of the inferior race became the first mechanical tools in the service of a growing civilization. Thereby, the way was clearly indicated, which the Aryans had to follow." So I'm going to keep going a little bit more. So as a conqueror, he subjugated inferior races and turned their physical powers into organized channels under his own leadership, forcing them to his will and his purpose. By imposing on them a useful, though hard, manner of employing their powers. So by powers, he means their like physical strength. He not only spared their lives, but he probably made their lives easier in the sense that their former state of so-called freedom was inadequate. And so what Hitler's doing here is he's saying that this is how civilization is formed and how it's always been formed. And in fact, he interweaves this whole discussion with a discussion of Darwin and how like nature's laws are well understood, and this is just how it has always been and how it always will be. And so this is why it's so scary, because it doesn't pretend to be a prophecy, it pretends to be science, and it pretends to be inevitable. And he, I think at one point Hitler talks about like the sledgehammer of fate. And so the mindset I think that you have to put yourself in when you're reading this essay is like, how the hell would you combat this widespread idea if everyone around you thinks that this is science and that this is inevitable, and that they're starting to prepare for the inevitability? And Popper once, I think, says, like, join us in bringing about the inevitable, as if all we can do is go to the revolution as quickly as possible and try to get through it because it's coming. Like, how the hell would you even begin to combat this? And so this is what he's dedicated a large portion of his life to working on. And so to start to take apart this idea, you have to first go into a discussion about what the difference is between prediction and prophecy. But then you also have to go into many more discussions. You have to talk about like what is science, and how come we can predict eclipses, but we can't predict revolutions. Like, why human beings are a natural part of the world, so why can't we make these predictions? And then we have to go further. We have to talk about like, what are laws of nature? Even if laws of nature aren't these historical laws, then what the hell are they? And we have to then talk about, well, the social sciences is a science, but what is the social sciences for if not unearthing these historical laws? And so all of these themes are going to be basically the subject of this chapter. And he wrote it essentially responding to fascism and communism. And so that's actually the epigraph of his book, which he says, it's in memory of the countless men, women, and children of all creeds and nations or races who fell victim to the fascist and communist belief in inexorable laws of historical destiny. And so when he wrote this chapter, but also his two big pieces on this, he was fairly light with examples, because the examples were so, I guess, dominant in the culture that he didn't really feel the need to go into the examples too much. And that was, I think, why I had a difficult time understanding the urgency of this subject, because the examples were so obvious at the time that he was writing that he didn't feel like he needed to spell it out. But when you flip open Mein Kampf and you see just how much of fascist ideology is justified in terms of this pseudoscientific belief in history, belief in laws of history, then I think the subject becomes quite real. So that's the revelation that I had the last couple of days, and why this I'm really excited to go into this chapter. So.
Jesus, yeah, that was a chilling intro. That was, I cannot say I read Mein Kampf in preparation for this episode, so I think you are definitely better prepared than I am.
Giving the listeners what they want, man. Just excerpts from Mein Kampf.
But, oh my god, yeah, it's very chilling to listen to.
Fuck, like, you should read this chapter of Mein Kampf, man. Like, it is fucking crazy. Like, it actually, makes me understand why these ideas took over so quickly. Like it was always a bit of a mystery to me. Like why did everyone all of a sudden find hating the Jews so persuasive? But when you tell people like you don't really have a choice, it's coming, whether you like it or not, then it's easy to see why it has such hold over people.
That's like, this is the way it's always been, and this is the way it always will be. So you better be on the winning side of history. Like it feels uncomfortable, but this is the way the natural world works, and therefore you must pick a side. Like, that's fucking terrifying, man. I mean, I guess one reaction that's possible on the part of the audience is like, well, except for the few Marxists who are still out there, most of us are anti-fascist and anti-communist, and we're going about trying to make a better world, understanding that there were these horrific ideologies, at least that led to horrific consequences in the past. But is this historicist doctrine still with us today? Like, are there historicists walking around, or is historicist type thinking embedded in some of our other ideologies? And so, I don't know, maybe do you think it's still, this type of thinking is as prominent as it was?
So certainly not as prominent. No, definitely not. Let's go to just the Cold War for a second. So for the audience, I think a couple keywords which will be useful are like scientific socialism. You can find a Wikipedia page on that, and also historical materialism. And so I talked a lot about like the fascist flavor of this, but the communist Marxist flavor of this is that you have these periods in history. So you had like the pre-communist stage when everyone's like hunters and gatherers, and then feudalism, and then capitalism, and then eventually the socialist utopia is coming next. And that animated from the beginning of the Russian Revolution, so like 1918, 1917 to the end of the Cold War. So compared to the 20th century, no, I wouldn't say that these ideas are as dominant as that. But I don't know if it is that there's historicists walking around, but I do think that it's a rhetorical move, which is quite common. And even in softer variants of it, it can be still quite pernicious. And that rhetorical move, I think, is common. For example, talking about the singularity. So like Ray Kurzweil's singularity, it is an inevitability that it's coming. Right. There is a historical law. It's called Moore's law, and it's not really about human beings. It's about just exponential curves. You could think of like just the green movement, particularly in some of its like incarnations in the early like 1960s and 70s, where like Paul Ehrlich foretold the impending population bomb, and that too was described as an inevitability. Doesn't matter what human beings do. It's the sledgehammer of fate. It is as scientific as just the exponential curve. But of course, he was totally wrong. And so I wouldn't say that it is dominating global geopolitics like it was in the 20th century, but I would say that it's important to become aware of this rhetorical move so that it loses a lot of its power. That would be my answer.
Yeah, interesting. I think I was sheltered from the historicist view a little bit just by virtue of my background. I think people who have my background might be as well. So people who sort of like working in tech or coming from more analytical disciplines don't tend to run across this in like undergrad throughout their education and whatnot. But I was like talking to my roommate the other day about just the podcast and things in general. And we got into a discussion about it, and he's doing a PhD in English. And so he, is part of the humanities department. And he says to run across Marxists is like pretty common. There's always, there's still lots of people who take these ideas very seriously. And, it's not by any means like embarrassing or anything to be like a Marxist in humanities departments and whatnot. And he says, people will like identify as communists, as Marxists, and it's like relatively common. And so probably this differs depending on like region, depending on what school you're at and whatnot. But I think I didn't realize that there are still people like awaiting the communist revolution out there who like still take this idea very seriously of like this, this thing is coming. And so anyway, so that was just for anyone, listeners out there with like similar backgrounds to mine or who haven't been in humanities departments and whatnot. I think possibly we underestimate the extent to which people still take some of these ideas pretty seriously. And so I don't know, for me, that was surprising to hear. Like I obviously people are like very sympathetic with like the goals and ideals of communism, but I didn't realize there were people who took the historical destiny part of communism very seriously. The dialectical materialism, as you pointed out earlier, which is Marx's his historical laws.
Well, because Marx took the ideas from Hegel. So Hegel believed in
his dialectic,
the dialectic and idealism. So rather than it being about the economy, it was just about these like grand non-material forces, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And then Marx took that basic framework of large forces and then just concretized it into economics. And in so doing, he gave it a scientific veneer, right? And that I think is what Popper is pushing back against, right? It's not understanding economic forces, but it is dressing up prophecy in terms of scientific veneer in order to give it power, right? Because if I said a race war is coming, where did I get that from? Well, I dreamt it. People aren't going to take me seriously, and there's not going to be world wars fought over this. But if I say it's coming, and it's coming because of the scientists and because we understand history, then it makes it very hard to argue against, right? And that is, I think, like one of the things which imbues it with so much power. And maybe I'll just say one other tiny point on the Marxist thing, which is that Marx, like Christ, or let's say Marxism, like Christianity, has many different interpretations, and they run the gamut from what we're talking about to like the extreme side to just let's say a concern with child labor laws and minimum wage and wanting slightly better worker protections and stuff. And so I don't want listeners to think that we're saying all people who are sympathetic to Marx believe in these inexorable laws of history. It's a very wide range of views. And like there are some things that like, just the abolition of child labor, I think was a direct consequence of some of Marx's critiques. And so he is a very complicated person. And I just want to clear up any ambiguity that, or any interpretation that says we're only pointing that he has bad stuff. He has done a lot of great stuff as well.
Yeah. Interestingly, actually, Popper is like very sympathetic with Marx as a human. Like he thinks his motivations were like very pure. He did seem to just want to help the working class and like alleviate a lot of the suffering that he saw that dominated the planet. He just borrowed ideas from a philosopher who was steeped in some bad ideas, namely Hegel, and then tried to apply them, and it's kind of like led him wrong, according to Popper. But so he was actually very, very sympathetic to Marx. And we're not trying to put up any sort of Fox News straw man that's saying any socialist type tendencies lead automatically to communism.
Exactly. So it's the scientific socialism, which I think is what his target is. So let's get into it a bit. So I think we hopefully set the problem up and why it matters a bit, hopefully a lot. But then he is going to tackle this subject in his essay. And so I think upon setting it up, he moves to talk about the difference between prediction and prophecy. So I don't know if that's where you want to go with it, but I suggest that is maybe one place we can eventually go. And I've spoke a lot, so perhaps you want to take a swing at the next big chunk.
Yeah, sure. I mean, also, do you want to, I see that there's a highlighted quote here that you seem to have been taken by. So I don't know if you just want to say a sentence or two about why you thought this quote was so interesting. The quote being, the oldest dream of mankind is the dream of prophecy. And so you seem to find that pretty compelling. So I maybe let you end on that note.
Oh, good point. Yeah. I think last time I mentioned the relationship between prophecy and astrology. Did I say something about that? If not, I'll repeat myself. Which is that like the first domain which humans were successful at making long-term predictions in, if that's grammatical, would be astronomy, right? The predicting, say, Halley's Comet or eclipses, I think is the salient example. And so it's not a coincidence that people tie being able to predict the celestial bodies with being able to predict life success and romantic success and success in all of your endeavors. And so I really like the quote of the oldest dream of mankind is the dream of prophecy, because I see the desire to do this everywhere. I see it in myself. I see it in wanting to predict election outcomes. I see it in wanting to predict, machine learning. My area is all about predictions, right? That's the main focus. And people want to use probability to do this. They want to be able to say what's going to happen hundreds of thousands of years from now. And the reason why I like this quote so much is because I think that we need to recognize that this is almost like a innate part of our human psychology, and wrestle with that ourselves, because I think it's really hard to do away with this idea of predicting the future. But once one sheds oneself of it, I think one can start to make progress, I guess. And so the reason I like that is because I think it's both poetic and true. It rings very true to me. So
nice. Yeah, so let's maybe get into the distinction a little bit of prediction versus prophecy. Popper frames the backdrop of wanting to develop historical prophecy against the success that's been had, for example, in fields like physics, where we had Newton's laws for a while, and then in the early 1900s, Einstein came along and improved upon Newton's theory, and thereby giving physics sort of unimaginable explicative power, right? So in a closed system, and systems where we can write down the variables, we can understand, we can make very, very precise predictions about, for example, how planets are going to move, how light is going to be bent around black holes around the sun, where Jupiter is going to be in the sky 18 months hence, or 106 months hence, and we can predict this down to accuracies that almost seem mind-boggling, right? To tenths of a meter, even predicting out 100 years forward. And then there's a question, right? Okay, well, physics is having such success, and other sciences, quote unquote hard sciences, are often having such success in their predictive power, right? Biology is taking off at this point, physics is taking off, chemistry is taking off. And one natural question here is okay, can we do the same with sociology, with economics, with anthropology? Can we start making these same sort of predictions? Because, as you said, after all, humans, we're just part of the physical universe. And so presumably we should be able to do this, right? If we had accurate enough sociological laws or psychological laws, we understood how human interaction worked, we understood the human brain, then we could begin to understand how history will unfold, how humans will interact together. Maybe we could have predicted the French Revolution, the American Revolution. So, there's a lot to say here, but I guess what I want to say is this is a natural thought to have, right? Okay, maybe humans are more complex, and human interaction is more complex. There's more variables to take into account. There's more to perhaps understand before you can have accurate prediction. But the desire to want that sort of prediction is pretty natural, I think, especially to have in sort of the early 1900s, late 1800s, when other sciences are having such success. And so, Popper then goes on to make an argument about why this can't be the case. And he draws a distinction in terms of talking about closed systems of predictive power where you can axiomatize things and you say if certain conditions are met, then something will happen.
Exactly.
These historical prophecies are sort of unconditional, right? They don't say if then, they just say humans will reach this goal at some point. There will be a class war and it will bring about communism. But I don't know. But for me, honestly, the easier way to think about it is just that our ideas are not influencing physical laws, whereas they are influencing like sociology and economics and psychology. So as soon as we try and make predictions about ourselves, we are affecting the very system that we're trying to predict, right? And so it's
like having an idea about Newton's second law of motion isn't going to change Newton's second law of motion. Unlike having an idea about a revolution might change the inevitability of such a revolution. Just to clarify.
And to make it very concrete, right? Like, suppose everyone knew, and I think Popper actually gives this very example. Suppose everyone knew that the stock market was going to plunge next Wednesday. Well, then everyone's going to go on Tuesday and take all their money out of the bank, right? Or rearrange their assets, and thereby cause the stock market to actually plunge Tuesday. Right. And so there's a very real way in which our actions, our ideas affect sociology in a way that our ideas about physics are not going to influence physics.
Yes.
So he doesn't talk about this so much in that chapter, but this is an easier way for me to think about why this sort of historical prophecy is kind of untenable.
When I first read this section, I had a huge light bulb moment, which is just the word you said about conditional predictions. I just want to emphasize that because that is one, I think, quick discerning, one quick heuristic to see if it's a prediction or a prophecy. So prediction says, if you boil water, then certain things will happen. The water will evaporate. A prophecy would be, in 2023, water will be boiled. There will be boiled water in this location. It's not stating under what conditions certain predictions will take place. It's just stating that something will happen. And so that is one, I think, very important distinction that historicism fails to make when it says it's a science. It says, well, sciences can make predictions. You can predict the effect of water. And so why can't historians do the same thing? Why can't we predict future history, which is intentionally oxymoronic in phrase. But the second thing he says is that, in fact, science doesn't make predictions very often. Prediction, which I thought was quite interesting, because I think this is a widely held misconception that most people have about science in general, that the whole point of it is to make predictions. And in fact, predictions are useful to verify certain things. But the main task of science isn't to predict stuff. It's to explain and understand stuff. Explanations are the goal here. And predictions can be useful in adjudicating between multiple explanations, especially when they make contrary predictions. But that's the other point, which is that science is actually less about prediction than people originally think. And then he says even further that, contrary to popular belief, the systems where you can make very long-term predictions, like eclipses or Halley's Comet, they are special cases, and they're actually particularly rare. And the special case is mainly just where prediction becomes particularly impressive. But that's about it. There's nothing uniquely special about predictions. And so in starting to criticize and dismantle historicism, he also has to explicate what science is. And that's, again, to situate this chapter in the context of a larger book, because he's simultaneously trying to explain to the world what is science and epistemology, and disabuse people of false notions of what they think science is. And so he's doing double duty here. So I just wanted to emphasize both those things.
Another sort of light bulb moment for me was when he talks about the fact that in these systems where we can predict very long run effects of things, they're typically cyclical in some sense.
Yeah.
So, the easiest example here is precisely like the solar system. We have planets orbiting around, and things are sort of occurring again and again in ways that lend themselves to predictive methods. And so this is sort of the same interactions are occurring over and over in predictive ways. And in the social sciences, then, there might be an urge to want to cast history as sort of a cycle, right?
Yeah.
In order to leverage this sort of predictive power. And I realized this has actually precisely been done, right? Like this was, for example, like Thomas Malthus, I think based his whole thing of like population growth and starvation based on just historical cycles of seeing population grow and then food shortages occurring because of growth and then population plummeting and then food shortage increasing. And so this is precisely like a cyclic tendency in history. And Malthus actually, he was predicting things about the future and he turned out to be very wrong because of scientific innovation, right? Because of the invention of, for example, like fertilizers and whatnot. But he was a good, I want to say historicist, but it's not a historicist, a history person. Yeah. So this up to that point, this had been historical trend, because there was a certain cyclical nature, but the point is that because of human ingenuity, because of ideas, because of creativity, we're able to sort of dig ourselves out of this repetitive trap of like population growth. And then food shortage. So anyway,
exactly, because society is changing and it's developing, but there is no law that says it has to be repeating itself, right? And this is the point that I was trying and failing to convey in our conversation with Mauricio. That like when we talk about similar situations and stuff, as the X-risk people are wont to do. It is it's fictional. There are convenient viewpoints that one could bring to a circumstance in order to say that it's similar to other circumstances. But this is always something that we are bringing into our interpretation of what's happening. It isn't a real thing intrinsically. It is a framing tool, right? And so we can see something happen now and something happen 100 years from now and frame it in a particular way that it looks cyclical, in the same way that Hitler, invidious comparison to the X-risk people, which I'm obviously not trying to make, but in the same way that Hitler can selectively talk about when one race dominated another race and then civilizations kind of started from there. But this is always, it's theory laden. It's something we bring into our historical perspective. It isn't an intrinsic part of history. Unlike, say, biological systems or astronomical systems, which are going to be cyclical, whether or not we think of them as cyclical. And that's a really key distinction. Okay, so let's maybe summarize before we get too lost. So we're answering the point or the question of like, if we can make predictions in the natural sciences, why can't we do it in the sociological sciences? And so the answer to that question is twofold. Well, one is we actually don't make predictions in the natural sciences as often as people think. And two, when we do make such predictions, they're either conditional. So if this happens, then this other thing will happen. Or they are based in very unique cyclical systems, which are rather isolated from the rest of the universe so that they can remain cyclical, right? Because if a supernova explodes, there goes the cycle. And so there has to be an isolation thing happening as well. And third, in the social sciences or in society, this is maybe a new point, but you can make some predictions, like you had said. You can predict that if supply goes up and demand remains constant, then price will go down. But that is a conditional prediction. So you can make some conditional predictions, but most of the time, society and history aren't recurring. So that is, I think, one answer, or a set of answers to the main question there. Did I miss anything in my summary of that, just so that we don't lose our audience?
No, that seems pretty good. One other point that we may or may not want to bring up is, I think, a point you actually made in your blog post with Mauricio, where like predicting the future of human activity, so like historical laws, relies on predicting human knowledge, because precisely human knowledge and ideas which influences the future trajectory of humanity. And therefore, any such prediction would require foreknowledge of what these ideas are going to be. And because we don't have foreknowledge of these ideas, we don't know what the future ideas will be, obviously. We can't with any accuracy predict what the future will look like. So I don't know if that takes us too far afield, or if you just want to say a word or two about that little impossibility result.
That takes us exactly smack dab into the field. So this is the opening, I think the preface of Popper's book, The Poverty of Historicism. And he says that up until this statement, he had been very critical of, say, historical prophecy. But he wasn't able to disprove it formally. But he was successful in disproving it formally, meaning it is a logical impossibility in exactly what you had just said. So in order to be able to make predictions about the course of future history, you have to be able to predict future knowledge. And future knowledge is the one thing which is impossible to predict, because to predict it is to know it before it's produced. Yep. And therefore, it is provably impossible to predict the course of future history when that future history depends on knowledge. And so it doesn't rule out things like predicting that certain conditions will lead to, say, tyranny or despotism or a recession. That's all fine, because it's always conditional. If this happens, this will happen. But so important distinction, and one that I would recommend to the readers to just read the first three pages of that book, because it's a beautiful distillation of a lot of these ideas.
Yeah, nice. I think I would also want to emphasize that even these sort of economic / sociological predictions that say if P then Q, right? So yeah, if demand goes down, prices will go down as well, or whatever. Then these are certainly less robust predictions, I think, than we are used to from the hard sciences, and that just has to do with the enormity of the number of variables in the problem, and the complexity of the problem and what we're trying to predict, and the uncertainty of so much of the background assumptions and whatnot. So I wouldn't want to put any of these sort of economic predictions on par with, for example, Newtonian mechanics or Einsteinian relativity or anything.
Although that isn't to say that as robust results aren't possible. I would say that laws of supply and demand are laws as much as any other laws. It's just that it's harder to characterize the conditions under which these laws hold. Would you agree with that? That it's not that economics is, say, less robust than physics. It's just that we're dealing with far more complicated systems. And so it's harder to both find signal, but also, once finding signal, make predictions based on it, because the conditions are just far more complex. And in fact, in physics, the predictions that people actually make are only possible because they assume away most of the complexity. Let's assume there's no air pressure. Let's assume that friction is zero. And so you just are actually able to assume away almost everything that makes the problem complicated in order to find an isolated, clean.
But there's also a difference in the extent to which removing a lot of the assumptions, or rather simplifying a lot of the background assumptions, affects the outcome of the problem. So, for example, in traditional economics, you're making so many assumptions about the pure rationality of the agents involved, that their utilities can be captured with very specific kinds of utility functions that obey very specific axioms, that the economy is perfectly efficient, and everyone has perfect knowledge of everything going on. And so in physics, you're able to simplify a lot of the assumptions, but your predictions are still can be almost perfect, because, for example, when you are making astronomical predictions, a lot of those terms sort of they vanish as distances, for example, get very large, or speeds become very high or something. Whereas in econ, I think there's way more background assumptions, and those background assumptions basically they don't actually occur in reality. And so for sure you can make very specific kinds of predictions in econ, but I think oftentimes those are in very idealized worlds, which don't actually capture like the true complexity of the economy around us.
Yes, so it would be like if physicists said, let's assume that friction is 0, but let's assume that friction runs in a completely different way than it actually does.
Right. Yeah,
so you make an assumption that we know to not actually even be held in nature.
Right.
Let's assume that gravity pushes rather than pulls. And so you're making assumptions in a much different way.
Yeah, that's not to say they can't be useful heuristics, but I think just a lot of the time because you're dealing with such complex systems with so many interacting variables, you just have to simplify or make very simplifying assumptions about people's behavior, for example, and these just like don't hold in reality. So
cool. Yeah. So to kind of carry us to the next half of this essay, he now has the problem on his hands of saying, okay, if the social sciences aren't about predicting history, then what the hell are they about? And so this is going to lead to the second half of the chapter, where he now has to fill the void, because let us not disparage the social sciences. We can do that in another conversation, but there is something to study, and the social sciences like economics and sociology do have a role, and so now he has to explain what that role is.
This was exciting for me to read. I think the first time I read this, and I realized like, oh yeah, this is persuasive. What he's saying here. So like you said, the social sciences are not in charge of generating historical laws that will guide humanity forevermore. So what are they doing? And this again ties into like the seed of the idea, which is at the core of popular philosophy, which is that humans are fallible. And so we're going through our life and we implement policies, and those policies have unintended consequences. They have side effects that we didn't foresee because we can't foresee them. And so the task of the social sciences is therefore to highlight precisely these consequences, both good and bad, things we did and didn't predict, and to understand what roles our actions are having on everyone, on different groups of people, on the economy, on people's psychology, everything. And so they're not a predictive science. They are looking at the policies we've put in play, and they're trying to highlight what the consequences, what the effects of these policies were.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't actually thought of it this way before. So imagine like there's 2 points in time, let's say 1900s and 2000s. The historicist wants to stand in year 1900 and predict what's going to happen in year 2000. And Popper is saying it's almost the other way around, where in year 2000, we need to look back at what happened in the year 1900 and trace what actually has occurred. So it's still dealing with large periods of time, but it is kind of looking at the rear view mirror rather than the out the windscreen. And in that way, it is trying to trace the unintended consequences of human action.
I struggle with this a little bit. And I think, once I asked you offline what he meant when he said the theoretical social sciences, and you gave me an answer and I didn't understand, so I just figured I'd ask you online again. He says the role of the theoretical social sciences, and he always puts that word theoretical in front of the word social sciences. And so I'm still not 100% sure what he means by that. Like, which disciplines is he talking about precisely? Because there does seem to be a role, to my eye, for modeling, for things that are not just like empirically tracing the outcomes of things that are trying to guide in which direction our policy should go, for example. And so that doesn't seem to quite fall in line or under the umbrella of what he wants the so-called theoretical social sciences to cover. So I didn't know if you had thoughts on whether he means by this, like all the social sciences that come to my mind when I think of social sciences, political science, sociology, economics, et cetera, or if he's talking about a very specific sort of sub-discipline here. To take a modern example, economists would definitely argue that part of their discipline is to provide us with the best, for example, financial policy of what to do in economic recession. So when COVID hit, the Federal Reserve in the US had to decide, what the fuck are we going to do, right? There's at one point there was 40 million unemployed people in the US. I think that was the peak, something like that. You have to decide, okay, we're going to provide a bailout package, or, there's multiple stimulus ideas that you might consider. And so what are you going to do? And so presumably a lot of economists they consider that their role, to step in and provide good ideas for what to do in various circumstances. And so this is not tracing unintended consequences. This is the exact opposite.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so later I do believe he says that you want to trace the unintended consequences in order to guide future action, right? If we know that action A leads repeatedly to a certain kind of unintended consequence, then that will remove action A from the choice of actions, even though we're not saying that action A will lead anywhere. To return to your question about the theoretical part of it, I think he just means those sciences which are trying to theorize. And you can make theories about, say, the causes of World War II. History is theoretical in the sense of trying to come up with a theory of what happened, right? But that is, I think, important to emphasize, because people, when he was writing, thought of the theoretical sciences as predictive sciences. Physics is a theoretical science. And so what does theory do? Theory makes predictions, damn it. And so history, if it's going to be elevated into the same tier as physics, then it too must make predictions. And I think what he's saying is, no. Theoretical sciences can make predictions. And if you want to theorize about how the world works, come up with explanations. So theory and explanation is almost synonymous in Popper's terminology. Then we need to broaden our conception of what it means to have a theory and what you can do with a theory, and recognize that to have a theory isn't necessarily to be able to make predictions, although some theories can allow you to make predictions. That would be my best stab at it. We should be on guard for writing or evidence of the contrary, but that's my take.
Right. Yeah, I mean, to some extent, if you are suggesting future action, you are making some sort of prediction, right? You're saying the actions that we are not considering will lead to worse outcomes, and therefore we are not going to consider them. So presumably when the Fed was considering what to do at the state of the economy, there were certain items that were not on the table that may have been on the table 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when economics was less developed. And presumably the claim there is that we know that these won't lead to as good of outcomes. And so that's prediction to a certain extent, right? You're predicting that if we were to implement certain policies, things would go wrongly. They would go worse than others.
Great. I think I need to refine slightly what I said, because I think I have a more improved answer. And this takes us to part 9 of this chapter. So we're nearing the end of it. I'm going to preface by zooming out a little bit and saying that what is he trying to do? He's trying to combat this widespread historicist view that science is about predicting things and discovering laws of nature. And now he's going to move into the question. So he's discussed what is the nature of prediction. He's discussed what is the nature of science, even what's science for, not prediction, but explanation and understanding. But now he has to go into what is the nature of laws. And this I find to be a very useful heuristic. So I'm just going to step away from the text momentarily and say that his solution to this I found to be just very useful in my own life, because the word laws tends to be bandied about quite cavalierly. People talk about laws of power. So there's a terrible book by this author named Robert Greene who it talks about the 50 laws of power, and it's like neo-Machiavellianism or something. It's like I read through it, and it's just atrocious. But he claims that this is a law. And so the heuristic, which Popper says, is, sorry, he doesn't say it as a heuristic, but I'm using it as a heuristic, is you can tell if it's a real law of physics, a real law of nature, a real theory, if it can be reformulated into stating what you cannot do. That's the key thing. So the law of thermodynamics can be reformulated into stating something like you cannot build a machine which is 100% efficient. Or a law in the social sciences would be you cannot, I'm just quoting Popper now, that you cannot, without increasing productivity, raise the real income of the working population. Or you cannot equalize real incomes and at the same time raise productivity. So I think this is the core of the answer to your question of what does he mean by theoretical. So if by theories you're trying to understand the world, understand the real world, then he says that the task of the theoretical social sciences is to discover the unintended consequences of our actions in order to be able to formulate statements about what cannot be done. If we find that you cannot, say, raise minimum wage to $1 billion in order to raise the GDP, and every time it's been tried to a certain point, you inevitably get unintended consequences, then you can reformulate this into a theory about what cannot be done. And in this way, this is, I think, what he means by the task of the theoretical. And this is, note, not a statement about prediction. It's a statement of impossibility and what David Deutsch is premising his entire constructive theory on. So it is, I think, a deep truth is that, like, if someone says there's a new law of history or a new law of power or a new law of physics, in your head, see if you can flip it around such that you can find out a statement of what it's saying is impossible. And laws of power, you won't be able to find one. Laws of history, you won't be able to find it. But laws of physics and laws of economy, you can. And so I think that is a better answer to your question about what he means by theoretical social sciences.
Yeah, that's a nice resolution of the paradox for sure. And actually ties in nicely with his idea of content of theories, right? So if a theory doesn't formulate anything that you cannot do, it's not saying anything about the world. So this is one of the big problems that he points out with, like, Marx's theories or Jung's theories, is that any conceivable future state of humanity, of the world, can be framed in terms of their laws, right? So you can always say, for example, with Marx's dialectical materialism, oh, the class war it's just around the corner. It's just about to come. Marx was just a little wrong about the timeline, right? And this is actually similarly with, like, Hegel's dialectic, right? I realized when I was younger, I was very captured with the idea of dialectic. Sometime when I read about it, and it was like, oh, this is amazing. You can capture so much with this idea. And then I don't know if I realized when reading Popper beforehand, but realizing, like, oh, wait a second, that doesn't mean the theory is strong. That just means it doesn't say anything, right? If you can capture every sort of phenomenon with the theory, then it has no predictive content. It's not saying anything about the world. And so a theory is only valuable insofar as it makes predictions about what you can't do, because then you can verify whether it's correct, right? This dialectic of Hegel's, where you just have a thesis, you have an antithesis, and then you have a synthesis. You can formulate basically everything that happens in history according to this, which, when you first hear of it, seems so amazing. You're like, wow, I can, like, capture history while thinking about a dialectic. But then you step back and realize, like, wait, is there anything that could happen that couldn't be framed in terms of a dialectic? And no, you can always find a sneaky way to talk about a thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. And so, it ties in nicely with his whole notion of falsification here.
So tie this back to the example, the analogy I drew at the beginning. Like, imagine a very persuasive politician who's orange but literate is talking about an impending race war, right? And then points to protests, points to the riots and say, or the protests, depending on your political view, in certain places in the U.S. There is evidence, like, how right am I that you can just see conflict after conflict, and it's the fact that it can explain everything. It's so enticing, but it has to be recognized as an intrinsic weakness. But at first it is eerie because you just get little premonitions that this prophecy is coming true, and it spurs urgency, and it will spur people to pick up rifles. And so, but the other thing that I want to highlight is that it's really cool when you get really immersed in a person's work. You start to see certain cognitive devices which they use, and one of Popper's is flipping the question around and attacking its negation. So if you think that confirmation is valuable, Popper flips it and says, no, actually, it's a weakness. Let's think about falsification. Here you see him doing it with theoretical laws of sciences, where you take a law and you try to formulate into restate it into what it can't do. And if it can't be formulated in that way, then it's vacuous. But you also see him do this with morality as well, where he has said that it's much better to basically target a negative form of utilitarianism, where we can all agree on what causes misery. So let's just all target the things which everyone agrees makes people miserable. Let's not deal with how to increase people's happiness. Let's try to deal with people's misery. Let's tackle concrete, real world things that cause misery.
Nice. Yeah. I just think, if there's one thing people take away from this episode, it's that this can be so valuable in your own life when you just look at anything, any idea people are expounding, and you try and look for not what it's getting right in its predictions, but what could possibly prove it wrong. And so this has obvious implications when it comes to like astrology and these things, but also just implications of just like people's advice and whatnot. And like this is a very powerful move that can shed light on a lot of nonsense when it's spewed. And this is especially pertinent, I think, when it comes to political beliefs, right? Like asking yourself what could change your mind on a topic, and if the answer is nothing, then I'm not sure what sort of political philosophy you have, but probably not a super robust one. Yeah,
well, I remember you saying that in one of our conversations, and I thought it was just like a super profound point that, like, if you are so certain in your beliefs and nothing will shake your certainty in those beliefs, then that itself should shake your certainty in them. And it's an excellent point, and actually I think brings us back to both where we began this podcast series with incrementalism and stuff, but also the end of this chapter, because to conclude, he talks about how historicism is one of the underlying, if not the underlying philosophy that justifies a revolutionary, destroy-it-all worldview. Because if you think that history is only going to go in one direction, and if you have no agency to change the inevitability of history, then you essentially have one move, and that is join the revolution or get out of its way. And so he ends by saying that, like, the reason why historicism is such a important target is precisely because it gets in the way of this incremental improvement mentality, which is the thing which we had named our podcast after. And so we had spent a lot of time talking about incrementalism, but I don't think have explored like the philosophy which underlies the opposite worldview, which is the revolutionary worldview, very much. And this is, I think, a key into that mindset. Not all of it, but the come help to bring about the inevitable mindset is I think quite scary and quite important to
Marx's famous line about lessening the birth pangs of the revolution, right? All we can do is get out of the way and lessen the birth pangs of the class war and the coming communist revolution. And so this is directly relevant to his whole philosophy.
Exactly, man. Any closing thoughts on your side? I think we're rounding out the chapter and also the hour and a half mark. So we should wind it up, wind it down, wind it left.
Yeah, not too much. I mean, I would love to just do an episode about like the state of the social sciences right now. And some of the problems I think I see with the way research is carried out, some of the scary tendencies and whatnot. But I think that's, slightly takes us too far afield from Popper's take on the social sciences. But you definitely did a good job at the beginning of this episode of scaring me about what happens if historicist doctrines are taken very seriously, and basically just left me awestruck and terrified for the rest of the episode. So I apologize to listeners if I was just pretty incoherent. I just had Vaden's voice quoting Mein Kampf in the back of my head. It just scared me, and I could not find my eloquence, unfortunately. Not that I can ever find my eloquence, but today was particularly bad, I feel like.
It's a good shock to the system, starting with a quote from Mein Kampf. I didn't warn you. I didn't give you a advanced knowledge of that, so I apologize.
My God, I needed freaking vodka for that, dude. Beer was not sufficient.
Well, Jesus. You know what's bad is I downloaded it a couple of days ago, and I was sharing my screen.
And then the FBI sent you an email?
No, well, I was sharing my screen, and then I just did the Control M to come up with a file, and then fucking Mein Kampf came up, and I don't know if the person on the other side saw that, but I realized I have to either rename it or something, because I don't want people to not only see Mein Kampf but see highlights in it, because I tried to find the right quote.
Oh my God.
But if you didn't know the context, then it's just some dude that you're collaborating with is highlighting a lot of sections of Mein Kampf.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so I have to change that. But
well, on that positive note,
yeah, let's conclude. All right, well, that was fun. Let's pick it up next time.
Freaking quote that I just love that we didn't fit in, so we'll have to fit it in some other time, but we can add it somewhere else. But it's this, but it is clear that the adoption of the conspiracy theory can hardly be avoided by those who believe that they know how to make heaven on earth. The only explanation for their failure to produce this heaven is the malevolence of the devil, who has a vested interest in hell. I'm just oh my God, this captures so many intuitions of friends of mine. Everything